Hello, my name is Robert Harrison, and I will be summarizing Chapter 10 of Radical Behaviorism for ABA Practitioners by James M. Johnston. Chapter 10 is entitled Radical Behaviorism, and he basically touches on all the main points, throughout the text of radical behaviorism, and then he goes through a bit of a history of how behaviorism started and then evolved into radical behaviorism, and then how radical behaviorism kind of came from that foundation. He then ends with a bit of an open-ended question as to kind of how we as upcoming practitioners or practitioners can sell radical behaviorism, to teachers, to parents, the importance of some of these basic concepts. Um, he starts off the chapter with an anecdote, as he always does, and this one is about Lynn and Penny. They are BCBAs who work together. Lynn is brand new, and Penny is her supervisor. Um, Penny has some experience with radical behaviorism, and Lynn does not. Penny basically gets concerned at how Lynn is talking about behavior, and she's talking about it in everyday terms, and she basically argues how this could affect Lynn's judgment about the direction and technicalities of treatment plans. So this kind of comes out later, again, after Johnston reviews all the main points of radical behaviorism. Then he kind of asks us as practitioners, if we disagree with any of that, then we need to kind of make sure we find a stance that we do agree with so that we can be more effective in our practice. So as he's reviewing some of those main points, the main points of radical behaviorism that he emphasizes in this chapter are that radical behaviorists view the verbal behavior of the researcher or the examiner as no different from that of the the behavior of the that is being observed or examined. So rather than being viewed as a superior form of knowledge involving logical domains and mental processes, explaining scientific findings is accepted as behavior no different than the behavior being explained. So that is definitely a main point that he emphasizes throughout this chapter. He also states Skinner's definition of radical behaviorism, which is the philosophy of a science of behavior treated as a subject matter in its own right apart from internal explanations, mental or physiological. So these are two other points that he emphasizes throughout this chapter, that we obviously ignore mentalism, and while we have made some quite good advancements in brain imaging and other physiological advancements, these by no means are explanations for behavior, and they can help paint a better picture and things of that nature, but again, they can't help explain the causation for behavior. So that's something that we talked about last week in this group, and I thought it was very relevant, and my eyes like lit up when I read this. So a good kind of quote that I pulled out and I wanted to say is that although a study may measure some sort of brain activity, for instance, the source of its assumed power to cause behavior may be assigned to mentalistic qualities such as anticipating, wanting, and so forth. So basically, kind of what he goes on to say here is that, it's great to be able to see more physiological information and to get more information in that manner. But then, based on that information, we're making up constructs, and we're basically making these indirect measurements and saying that they represent a mental construct, and then that is the causation for behavior. So obviously, there's a lot of leaps in that reasoning, and that is just not something that a radical behaviorist is willing to subscribe to. Um, so again, I just thought that was great because it was very it was better articulated than I could say it last week, and I think that was just great. So It goes on to he continues to say that radical behaviorists view behavior as a subject matter in its own right. Again, it can't be some side effect of a mental process or a physiological process. He kind of wraps up the main points by emphasizing how radical behaviorism is thoroughgoing. He gives reasons that it's thoroughgoing because it's conceptually consistent across all circumstances, that it rejects all intrusions of mentalism or any other construct such as that, and then it approaches behavior and its controlling variables regardless of what they are on the inside or the outside of the organism as the same, as I mentioned earlier. Then Johnston goes in to talk about the history of behaviorism, or excuse me, the history of kind of how we observed or viewed behavior. It started off very mentalistic. There was a lot of introspection, even with early psychology. And then he explains how Watson's first paper in 1913, entitled Psychology as the Behaviorist Views It, kind of helped that whole SR behaviorism movement. And that really held water until 1930, until it's just some of the shortcomings of that research led to SOR behaviorism, in which basically, the O standard for operationism. So they have stimulus, then operationism, then response, and that operationism basically stands for adding in inferences, which is super mentalistic and counterproductive of behaviorism. That O would often, again, infer about motives or tendencies or attitudes and moods and other constructs that just aren't productive for measuring the function of a behavior. So then Skinner was not impressed with that, and he kind of came back with this radical behaviorism approach, in which he emphasized some of the main points that I just touched on, and less of the colloquial influences that SOR behaviorism had fallen under. Johnston then goes into kind of compare radical behaviorism and methodological behaviorism. He touches on some of the main points of methodological behaviorism. This is very rooted in conventional science. The main 5 points that he gives all kind of consist of very strict and rigid scientific processes to test a hypothesis, and they're looking for replication and reliability and all that. And the main flaw of this, that Johnston argues, of this viewpoint, is that after all of that scientific examination, then these examiners then judge the data. They interpret the data. So that's inherently mentalistic. That is not productive, and that is not something that radical behaviorists want to subscribe to. So then he goes on to ask if it's a matter of opinion, and in that he again talks about how this is a way of talking about behavior. This perspective, this philosophy, is a way of talking about behavior, which leads me to kind of my first question, which I touched on earlier, and he asks as well. So I'm going to ask you all: do you disagree with any particular element of radical behaviorism? And then he goes on to again say that if you do, you owe it to yourself and colleagues and clients to make sure that you are able to find what you do believe in and stick with that while you're practicing. So then later on in the chapter, he's asking us how we can sell behaviorism, how we can teach it to others, and emphasize the important points of radical behaviorism. And so after that question, I want to also ask one more. How can people who see no problems with everyday language, again, as radical behaviorists should, with that everyday language, such as just using mentalistic terms. So how can people who see no problems with everyday language and lack a background in behavior analysis ever be attracted to this view of behavior? Should they be attracted to it? Should they just be, informed about it? What is your take on that? Thank you for listening.